Come on in, everybody. Let's talk about this case that I have been obsessed with, the House of Cards. This is the fall of Paul Canero. Let's get into it, shall we?
A sweet old auntie. Thank you, subscribers and my nieces and nephews. All of y'all who have been here through the long haul. Shall we get into it? Oh, yes, we shall. It's time for Auntie Advice. It's time for Auntie Advice. It's time for Auntie Advice.
This is a deep one. Welcome, everybody. Let's talk about the New Jersey mansion horror. This story is unbelievable. I've been following it. I'm still looking at a lot of the court case and everything, but I just wanted to come out and share this with you all. It's an unbelievable story, but it needs to be told. Paul and Keith Canero grew up in Brooklyn and Staten Island. They were the kind of brothers who basically became each other's best friends, along with their youngest brother, Corey, right? They were a tight knit family, and they were the kind of siblings where they were glued together and holding everything together. When Paul and Keith got older, right, and started making money, they did what close brothers do. They stayed close. They each brought a multi-million-dollar home just 12 miles apart from one another in New Jersey, settling into the quiet, ritzy alcove of Colts Neck. And this is the kind of place where Bruce Springsteen and John Bon Jovi set down their roots, where high finances professional commute to New York City and come home to peace and tranquility in the suburbs. This was the be all to be all. They were each other's best men at their weddings. They had children around the same time. They were every outward measure the picture of brotherly love and success. But we know with every story, right, there's always something else that's going on underneath the surface. This family's connection to business went all the way back a generation. In the mid 1980s, a man named Stephen Weinstein, a CPA, right for TNAC, who had been in the profession for over 40 years, met the brother's uncle, Joe, who ran a small business in Brooklyn. Through the uncle, he met the boy's father, Caesar. And through Caesar, he met Paul and Keith. This was a family account that would span for decades. Weinstein would eventually prepare tax returns for the uncle, the fathers, the brothers, their wives, and their children, and their children's children. He was invited to holiday parties. He attended Keith's wedding. He was in the way that accountants sometimes become a part of the fabric of your family's life. Keith had founded the tech company himself, a consulting and network installation firm that started life as J. Martin Consulting Inc. and later operated under the name Square One. So in the beginning, the brothers had worked for other companies, doing computer work for a firm called the Marketers, I believe, then building relationships that led to work at Citibank, Republic Bank, and eventually the advertising giant Ogilvy and Mather. Okay, and that is where Paul traveled extensively doing computer consulting for them. Child, the world was their oyster. When Square One was up and running out of Brooklyn, Keith hired his first employee. And guess who that was? His brother, Paul. The company moved over the years from Brooklyn to Woodbridge, New Jersey, and then Homedale, then Asbury Park. They were rising, weren't they, y'all? They also opened a second company, J. Martin Systems, to sell computer equipment, which they eventually folded back into Square One. Later, a friend of Keith's who ran a pest control company out of Queens, a firm called Echo Star, needed guidance, and the brothers eventually came on as owners. By the end of this family empire consisted of two companies operating out of the same Asbury Park, Square One and EcoStar. Keith owned 90% of Square One. Paul owned 10. EchoStar was split equally between them. Their homes were mansions. Their driveways held Porsches from the outside. The Canaro brothers were everything. The Square One was the more profitable of the two businesses that the brothers owned, and his fortunes were increasingly tied to a single enormous client, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. So by 2017, 2018, the Duke Foundation accounted for 90% of Square One's revenue. It was a precarious dependency, and everyone in the business knew it. So, over the years, Weinstein had watched the financial rhythm of both companies closely. He reviewed their bank reconciliations, assisted with sales tax filing, managed their payroll records, handled their correspondence with tax authorities. So when things got tight, and they eventually did, he helped work out installment plans with New York State, with New Jersey, and with the IRS. Money moved in complex ways through their business, and Keith would loan the company money. The company would pay it back. Paul would do the same. So the American Express corporate card ran large balances. Keith had the company pay his tuition when he went back to school to make himself more marketable. These were not unusual arrangements, okay, for a closely held family business. But underneath all of this, there was some fool-la-la going on. Something else was absolutely going on. Because, honey, Paul had kept a secret. He was claiming disability. Following a serious accident that required approximately 10 surgeries, Paul had begun collecting Social Security disability payments and payments from a separate individual policy through a company called Sun Life. He also owed the IRS, as we say in my community, IRS, roughly $80,000. His disability income hadn't had taxes withheld, and he had fallen behind. Mr. Weinstein helped him work out an installment plan. Y'all know about them installment plans. If you don't, Don't find out about him, okay? And all the while, Keith was quietly routing payroll payments to Paul's wife so the family would still have income, since Paul technically couldn't be paid directly while claiming to be disabled. And you know that ain't gonna work. It's not gonna work. So the good brother was bankrolling the life of the man who was robbing him. Paul was not taking a salary and disability checks. He was not only doing that, right? Getting a salary, getting a disability check, double dipping. We call that double dipping. He also had a girlfriend. Now, living in this prestigious neighborhood, don't forget the picture that I just drew for you. They living large, honey, and in charge. They got all these connections. They doing the damn thing. Got a little family and all of that. Close with his brothers, the three amigos. But not only was he taking a salary and disability, he had a girlfriend on the side. He had brought her an Audi. He had taken out loans against his 401 k retirement account. His personal expenses ran between $300,000 and $400,000 a year. I wish. And he had found another source of funds entirely: the irrevocable life insurance trust that Keith had established in the late 1900s or early 2000s to protect his damn family. The structure of the trust was straightforward. Keith's life was insured through Canada Life. The premiums were paid quarterly. The money to pay those premiums flowed through a dedicated TD bank account funded by payroll transfers from the two companies. So, as a trustee, Paul was the only one responsible for managing that account, for making sure that all of the premiums got paid and got paid on time, and for maintaining the records and for keeping the whole thing running. But Paul was actually doing something else. Every year, Weinstein needed to trust TD Bank statements to prepare the annual gift tax return. So let me paint a picture. In the earlier years, the statements were simply waiting for him when he came in. But as time went on, he had to request those things from Paul, who would then email them to him. So when Weinstein, which is their accountant, of course, eventually sat down with those statements and he went through them with his red pen in hand, making check marks, tracing the flow of money, what he found was damning. Months after month, funds were entering the trust account through payroll credits, right, from the two businesses. And month after month, money was quietly leaving and bleeding out through debits to an account whose last four digits was 3837. The money was not going to Canada Life. Child, it was going somewhere else. Well, for example, in January 2018 alone, we just talking about 2018 to January, a 1,000 debit on the 2nd, a 500 debit on the 10th, 2,500 gone on the 22nd, and all to account 3837. February, another $2,200 was gone out the account. And on it went month after month after month. Many of them had no check number attached to them, a detail that would later raise questions about whether those payments were real or whether or not they was fake. The statements that Weinstein received covered January through September of 2018, but he never get that October one. He never got the final months of the year either. He was not the only one who had noticed these problems, because in early 217, both Weinstein and Keefe had become aware that money was going into the trust account, but the insurance premiums were not being paid. So they reached out to Paul. They didn't get no answer. The premiums have fallen so far behind that the insurance policy had been forced to reactivate an automatic premium loan provision, effectively borrowing against itself to stay in force, accruing interest on top of the existing principal. Cha. So when Weinstein pressed the matter back in 2017, Paul finally acknowledged what had happened. He said the money had been misdirected, the, the sent to the wrong payee by mistake, to a school loan. He put it in writing. The email was dated April 11th, 2018. It was sent from Paul to Keefe and copied to Weinstein and the family's outside insured advisor, Mr. Ronald Artis. And the subject line read, Trust Reconciliation. Y'all get where I'm going? In it, Paul admitted that payments totaling 25,541.77, 25,000, I'm sorry, money meant for the insurance premiums in 2017 and 2018 had instead been directed to a school loan. How does that happen? He calculated the figures. He promised repayment, and at the bottom of the email, in what would become one of the most quoted lines of the whole trial, Paul wrote, Sorry for all the confusion. I had my head up my ass. So, of course, Weinstein went through the numbers himself, making handwritten notations in the margins. And you know, when your accountant child is making handwritten notes in the account, it's time to have a meeting. The math was not adding up. It wasn't neatly tied in a bow. But the directions was clear. Money was leaving the trust and going somewhere else that it had no business going. And y'all, let me tell you, that wasn't a half of it. Let me tell you, I have been into this case. Y'all hear me? The defense attorneys, during cross examination, would later establish that the diversion of the trust funds had not begun in 2017. No, child. Child, this went all the way back 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. Debits had been flowing from the trust account to accounts that had nothing to do with Canada Life, including in early years to an account ending in 1361 at that point, which turned out to be an old operating account for J. Martin Systems, a company that had already been dissolved years prior. Remember, I told y'all that money from a life insurance trust meant to protect Keith's children had been quietly siphoned into accounts connected to the business. And so the full picture of what Paul had taken would not emerge all at once. Okay, because you at this point now you got to do a straight up forensic audit. Okay, you got to be just going down and digging down in people's drawers. But The records basically show that over the years, between trust diversions, the missing premiums, and other accounts, the number approached $500,000. And not only that, Paul still owed $80,000. Remember that he had been directly confronted about downtown in November of 2018, and he ain't have no way of repaying that. So in 2018, against his backdrop of financial crisis, the little girlfriend out there was a potential lifeline. There was somebody who was going to buy it. They was going to buy EcoStar. A major pest control company, Terminex, had expressed some interest, right? I know y'all know about Terminex, okay, in acquiring the business. On November 15th of 2018, Weinstein sent an email to both brothers with the offer of $850,000. He called it a tremendous number. He told them that they should start the process. He offered to work out the tax consequences. What you not gonna do is play with me with no taxes. You do a whole bunch of stuff, but we gonna be playing with our ass. Keith responded, agreed, let's do it. Then he typed, Paul. Paul took his time. He noted that they had been offered 850, framing it as something in the past tense, not a present reality. He had been putting together financial projections for the company, arguing that the revenues was growing and the sale price could be higher if they waited. He thought that let's just hold out on this, y'all. We can get more than 850. So in August, Mr. Weinstein told Keith in an email, he said, I'm documenting all this because I ain't getting caught up in this foolishness. He told him in an email that time was on their side, that the company was improving and the price would likely rise. So Keith and Paul have both been cautiously optimistic about it, but the negotiations had continued through the fall, and somewhere along the way, the offer had dropped by 100,000. Now, Paul held out. He thought he could be 850, let alone 750. But what changed everything was the Duke Foundation. Now, they're coming into the picture in November. Keith got word that his contract with the Duke estate, the contract that represented over 90% of Square One's revenue, might not be renewed. Without it, the business was worth dramatically less. And so Keith's position was, I need to shift my thought, and I need to do that quickly. Keith, he was now motivated to sell EchoStar quickly. He didn't care what price Terminex was offering, because at this point, the foundation is shaken. So Paul and Keith was suddenly on opposite sides of the deal. They was, one was negotiating for one thing, so the other one was negotiating for something else. And that was before the conversation turned to where the money had even went. So one night Keith spoke with Stephen Weinstein at least 3 times by phone on the evening of November 19th, 2018. Y'all, this was the night before Thanksgiving Eve, the night before his family would be preparing to host the holiday dinner. Keith was not calm. He had discovered again that money was missing from the trust, that the premiums still were not being paid, that the account had been drained. And of course, he was peed, owed. He was furious, as I would be. as you would be. And so the accountant would later describe his demeanor that night as very upset, just wanting to do something about it. He wanted to contact the TD Bank, right, first thing in the morning to find out what was happening with his account. And so when the accountant told him to calm down, it was late around 7 in the evening. He told them they would sort it out in the morning. So Keith would not live to see the morning, y'all. Prosecutors had recordings. Keith's side of separate phone calls with Paul, captured by surveillance equipment in Keith's home. In the courtroom, the jurors would hear Keith's voice ringing out alive again in that room, shouting at the top of his lungs at his brother, "Where's the money? Where did it go? Give me your password." He was demanding access to those daggone accounts, and he was demanding answers from his brother. He was wanting to know and demanding where the 80K went and give it back and tell me what happened. He had basically given him an ultimatum. He gave Paul an ultimatum in 2 days. Make it right. Now all his stuff is on the street. He getting exposed. How many of y'all know when you start playing, when the money get funny, but as y'all know, Paul, he had no way to make it right. Where was he going to get this money from? He had no $80,000. He had no way to repay half of $1 million. He had IRS installment plan. He was drawn disability, which many people thought was fraudulent. He had a girlfriend, a sports car he had brought for her, and a lifestyle where the money ain't match it. To top it all off, the Duke Foundation contract was in jeopardy. EcoStar sale had stalled. His brother was now threatened to expose him, and Keith had no doubt that his brother would have gone to the police. And so guess what? His little house of cards, his little scheme was crumbling right before his eyes. And Paul chose to bring the whole house down with it. So on November 20th of 2018, the theory prosecutors laid out at trial went like this. At 1:29 in the morning on November 20th, Paul walked into the control center of the security camera system at his own home in Ocean Township and turned it off. The last frame of footage showed him moving towards the panel, then nothing. When police later asked about this, Paul said the cameras had been slowing down his Wi-Fi and internet, and that was at 1:30 in the morning, when his ass should have been asleep. He had simply gotten up to turn them off. It was an explanation so thin it was nearly transparent. So at some point in the pre-dawn hours, Paul drove to his brother's home in Colts Neck. The mansion sat on an expansive property. This was not a neighborhood of close houses. It was land and space and distance, the kind of space where sound didn't carry. He cut the power to the house. Then he cut the backup generator. The lights went out. The house went dark and silent. And Keith did what anyone else would do. He went outside to see what was going on. But His brother was waiting for him. Paul shot Keith multiple times in the head, in the lower back, and left him on the front lawn. Inside the house, Jennifer heard something. She moved towards the front door. Paul shot her in the head and stabbed her multiple times in the torso, in the back, and in the chest, and in the abdomen. A forensic pathologist would later observe that using both a gun and a knife on the same victim, shooting her and stabbing her suggested a frenzied, deeply personal attack, a range that a single weapon couldn't contain. This is the family, y'all. The nice evidence would suggest it came from the kitchen. Paul had not brought it with him. He had found it there in the house where his brother and sister in law had lived, where his niece and nephew had grown up, where he had been a motherfucking guest at holiday dinners and birthday parties. He picked it up and used it. And unfortunately, then came the children. Jesse was 11 and Sophia was 8. They were awake now. They had heard things in the night, sounds that didn't make sense to them. Chaos where there should have been silence. Perhaps they called out. Perhaps they hid, y'all. Either way, Paul found them. He stabbed them both. He stabbed Sophia so many times that the medical examiner on the stand at trial said that they lost count. They know that it was more than 40 wounds on the body of an 8-year-old little girl. She fought back. In her final moments, she clawed at her uncle, and she left something behind. Her blood, her DNA transferred to his pants. And this is her little brother. Rest in peace, baby. When Paul was done, he set the mansion on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence of what he had done inside of that house. But Jesse and Sophia were not yet dead when those flames began. They were hanging on. Smoke inhalation would ultimately contribute to their deaths. Even though this little girl, Sophie, was stabbed so many times that they stopped counting, she was still alive. The medical examiner would later confirm that the fire was still burning around them while they clung to their life. And the sad part about it is they could have perhaps have been saved. Paul drove back to his own house. He poured gasoline on his cars and set them on fire. He set his house on fire too, while his wife and his 2 children were asleep inside. I just need to pause. They later found a gas can near the garage door. There were scorch marks on the hood of the car that showed where the gasoline had been thrown. But his family, thank God, escaped. Evidently, his plan was two fires, two brothers targeted simultaneously, a story of a outside enemy, someone targeting them because of their lucrative tech business, which he knew he was dragging into financial ruin. He wanted this to look like a professional hit, in my opinion, a mystery, a crime that needed to be solved. What a sick mofo. Now I'm keeping it together. Auntie, you gotta keep it together. You gotta keep it together. You gotta keep it together. So at 5 in the morning, fire and police responded to the house. Paul's family was out. Paul stood in the street as officers arrived. A neighbor spoke to him. They later reported that they found him nervous, a little upset, understandably shaken, right? Or at least that's what she thought. For a man who had nearly lost his wife and his daughters. And so he told the officers that he had hurt his hand somehow volunteering the information before anybody even asked him about it. Because he know they noticed that a hand. He mentioned smoke. He said he didn't think he'd run out of gas. He sat. By some accounts, he watched his house burn down to the ground. People later on know that it was just strange. A man who's sitting out there with his house on fire. His family is standing outside with him at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he is not screaming. He didn't attempt to go and get a garden hose. It just wasn't doing what a human would do, watching their house burn down and all of the chaos around him. Now, mind you, his brother's house is on fire. But they was like, what the fuck is going on with him? You know how you just have that eerie feeling about something? You know, you just notice a little twitch of the head or a rolling of the eyes. Like, you know, during times like these, you pick that stuff up and you don't even know you pick it up until you sit back and gather yourself. And then you be like, you know what? He really wasn't, like Paul wasn't acting like a man who's about to lose everything. He ain't doing nothing. According to the prosecutors, right? They said if you view it from the right angle, it made a terrible kind of sense. Paul had already committed quadruple murder. Watching a fire that he had set basically himself was the easiest thing he did all night. So at 12:30 in the afternoon, a neighbor named Boris, child, noticed something wrong at the property on Willow Road and called 911. So the call was a little confusing at first. A man rattled, struggling to communicate, moving as he spoke. He told the dispatchers there was a fire. When he was asked for the address, he fumbled Willowbrook Lane, Willowbrook Road, number 40, maybe 44. He's calling about a fire, but he's not sure. He had come around from behind. He said he had pulled out from a neighbor's property. He opened the door and found smoke and then something else. There was a person laying down. So the dispatcher asked if he could get around to the front. So Boris said he was heading over. Then his voice changed and he said, "Oh my God, there's blood here. It's dead." So the dispatcher was like, "What's dead?" And he was like, "Somebody in there dead." So the dispatcher told him to get to a safe area, get your side of the get to a safe area. Child, I ain't have to tell Boris that Boris was already backpedaling. He was leaving that property. He was trying to find a house number, right, so he could correct it. So he corrected himself, and he was like, "It's number 15. It's not 44. It's 15." And there's a body on his. There's a body in there. But by the time he spelled out his name, the firefighters was already there and on their way, right? So basically, they arrived at 12:38 p.m. When they extinguished the fire, they found all four of the bodies. The medical examination quickly established that none of the four had died from the fire. They had been shot and stabbed before the flames were set. Now, later on, of course, they did discover that the two children had, in addition to having the stab wounds, they believed that the fire is what ultimately killed them. They were hanging on for dear life. The fire had been meant to erase the evidence. Why do people think that technology is not what it is now? This is not in the old days where you set a fire, honey, and they got to come with buckets and that there is no forensics. Like, I realized through watching crimes shows and podcasts and all that, there basically is nothing that you can't that you there is basically nothing that you can do that is not being caught on videotape somewhere, somehow. There is nothing that you can do, no place that you can go where your cell phone is not pinging every tower you pass. And there is no fire that you can set that they are not able to go through and dig how the fire started, when it started, and what you used to start it with. I don't know why criminals think that technology is not ahead of them. So instead of him covering up evidence, he basically revealed it. Keith, his brother, 50 years old, is dead on the lawn. Gunshot wounds to the head and his lower back. Jennifer, who was 45 years old, was found inside. A gunshot wound to the head and multiple stab wounds across the torso, the back, and the chest. Jesse, 11, multiple stab wounds. And Sophie, 8, multiple stab wounds, more than 40. And you know why? Because that little ass was fighting back. You better go, Sophie. Sophia. I'm sorry, not Sophie, Sophia. Meanwhile, Corey, the youngest brother, who had rushed to Paul's side that morning, convinced that they were being hunted, was trying to help the man who had just killed his family. He had been trying to protect them. He would spend the next 7 years watching the trial. When investigators searched Paul's home and vehicles in the days after the fire, what they found dismantled whatever story they had already thought that they knew. So basically, in a large gun safe, right, there were multiple weapons and ammunition. Among them was a 9mm handgun, whose shell casings appeared to match those recovered near Keith's body. on the property. And in a basket of dirty laundry in the basement, Paul's pants was there. And guess what was on Paul's pants? Sophia's DNA. Nearly a bloody latex, and they had a latex glove nearby, a knife that still had Sophia's blood on it. He had brought them home. He had put them in a laundry basket, and he apparently believed that that would be enough because, after all, he was going to burn up all the evidence. Or so he thought. The security camera footage, which Paul had deactivated, remember I told y'all earlier in the story that he did deactivated at 1:29 a.m. because it was messing up the Wi-Fi? That footage was retrieved anyway. And the investigators obtained it over legal objection, and it was ruled admissible. And the last image, Paul walking towards the control panel, and then blinking darkness. Cell phone records knew what his movements were. Arson investigators, working with a science far more sophisticated than most people understand, could trace the origin points and accelerant patterns of both the fires. The phone records even showed Keith Cole's heated, desperate recorded confronting his brother about the missing money, and let's not forget the financial records. They told the complete story. 19 documented instances of theft in 2018 alone. Trust accounts showing years of diverted premiums and missing funds. This evidence is stacked against him. An email in which he admitted in writing that he had sent trust money to a school loan instead of to the insurance company, tax returns showing disability income, IRS debt, and expenses that had no rational source. The Audi, the car he brought for his girlfriend, the Porsches, the credit cards, the lifestyle of a man spending $300,000 to $400,000 a year on money he had stolen from his children's college fund. When the accountant child got up on the stand, he had known them for like 35 to like 40 years. Child, he sat in that witness chair and he walked the jury through everything that was going on. Child, he basically told everything. He talked about the irrevocable life insurance trust, how it had been set up in the 1990s, how Keith's life insurance was held inside it to keep the proceeds out the estate, how TD Bank account had been established to fund the quarterly premiums, how Paul had been named the sole trustee. Keith had no access to the account. He wasn't a trustee. The only person who could move money in and out of there was, guess who? Paul. The accountant showed the jurors everything, child. He showed them bank statements, January through September of 2018. He showed the months that Paul had sent them, the months he had gone through with a red pen, making check marks and annotations. He pointed out all the debits going to some account number 3837. He pointed to the Canada Life payments that lacked check numbers. He described requests of the October statements, and he never get it from his ass. He described November the 19th, the last time he spoke to Keith. The 3 calls over the course of the afternoon and evening, Keith furious, wanting to call the bank first thing in the morning, wanted to find out what had happened to the money. Child, our accountant was urging him to calm down, telling him to get some rest, telling him he had to handle it in the morning. And then the prosecutor asked, right, did you ever speak to Keith again? And the accountant like paused. And the next thing that he said out of his mouth gave me shivers. He said he was murdered. So the next day he found out when a call came in from another associate asking if he had heard the news. He was in total shock. He tried to reach Paul, right, but of course Paul never responded. Under the cross examination, a defense drew out what it could. So they was just pulling stuff out of a hat. They acknowledged, right, that the trust account had not been perfectly funded, right, in the prior years, and that money had moved in and out of the business in complex ways. That both brothers had loaned money to the companies and taken money out. That the American Express corporate card had run large balances, that Keith himself had used company funds for personal expenses like tuition. A balance sheet from November 2016 pulled from the Square One QuickBook files show that Paul was actually owed more by the company than Keith was at that point. 179,000 compared to Keith's 118, suggesting that at least at one time Paul had put more in than he had taken out. They also talked about in April of 2018, as we discussed earlier, when Keith first confronted Paul about this, right, about the missing money, that Keith was furious, not just with Paul, but with everybody. He said in his police record, right, the accountant, that Keith had wanted to remove Paul as the trustee at that point. But months went by and nothing changed. Paul was still a trustee in November. Y'all, there was a narrative about the pans. It was a lot of stuff that went on, but they started talking about the DNA about the pans. It was a question of whether or not the pans fit, and they did. And not only did the pans fit, but the DNA fit as well. The gun fit. And Paul had to sit in that courtroom motionless and expressionless while his dead brother's voice was being played on the speakers, right, demanding to know where the money had gone. The defense was trying to pin it on the third brother who ain't had to do with it. They had the nerve to start talking about Corey. Corey, of course, was the youngest of the three. He had never even been a suspect. Won't nowhere around. He had nothing to do with these murders. He was not a party to any of the financial stuff that was going on between Paul and Keith. He was not involved in even running the business. He didn't know anything about this. And he definitely didn't know anything about anybody being a beneficiary. He had been close enough to the brothers that when the fires broke out, right, his first instinct was to call Paul and try to help him to gather the family to get them to safety because someone was basically targeting them. The defense had pointed out, right, that law enforcement had searched Paul's house, his vehicles, his electronics. They had never searched Corey's. They had pulled surveillance cameras from the area around Paul's house. They had not done the same thing around Corey's. Like, what Corey got to do with this? They tested Paul's DNA. They ain't test Corey's. They had never even obtained a formal statement from Corey because Corey was asleep. Corey was asleep. Corey sat through their trial, lost both of his brothers, and watching another one be accused of committing it, and then the defense gonna come up there and use his name. He had nothing to do with this. The trial reached the jury. I'm wrapping this up, y'all. On January 12th, 2026, the prosecutors laid out the case: the financial motive, the physical evidence, the timeline, the phone calls, the trust account, the pants in the laundry basket. And Paul sat stoic. He did not react as recording after recording was played. He didn't react when his dead brother's voice was filling the courtroom, demanding passwords and explanations and the return of money that was long gone. Not he didn't even squinch his face. The only exception came during the medical examiner's testimony, the autopsy findings, the condition of the children's bodies, the number of wounds on Sophia. At that time, something shifted in his face. He appeared to be crying. Now, I don't know whether he was crying because he was remorseful or something else, but no one in that room knew basically who he was because he was so stoic. But honey, when them jurors came back after 4 hours of deliberation, guilty, 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 and guilty. Paul was convicted on all 15 counts: 4 counts of first degree murder, theft, and aggravated arson. So on May 19th, as I told y'all, I've been in this, Paul stood before a judge in Monmouth County for the last significant public moment of his life. The judge called him evil. He said Paul had a depraved heart. He said greed and jealousy had driven him to kill 4 people, and 2 of them were children. All of them, his blood. It's just your blood brother, your nieces, your nephews, your niece and your nephew. The judge also made sure to note that Paul had stood motionless through the trial. He noticed that even through the victim impact statements, through the long sentencing procedure, he had no emotion and acknowledged nothing. And even when he was given the opportunity to speak, he chose to say nothing. His attorney said on his behalf that his client maintained his innocence and had nothing further to add. Unbelievable. Y'all, this is the house. Like, ultimately, the judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms, plus 16 years on top of that, without the possibility of parole. The judge, in this case, had a little trick up his sleeve, in my opinion, because he could have made the sentences run concurrently, right? Could have legally done that. Even one life sentence would have meant that Paul likely would die in prison. But the judge has seen, right, how he was acting and what happened, and he has seen it in the past, what has happened when people have had life sentences that have run together. He was not leaving the door open for no bull crap to happen, because previously the judge had referenced a case where a New Jersey man was convicted of killing a police officer, and he had served 30 years and had been released by the parole board. And he was like, I ain't got that to do. 4 consecutive terms meant Paul would have to complete 30 years before beginning the next 30. He gonna die in prison. And they ain't got no type of mathematical way of getting him out. And so now in their little town, you know how you hear on news when people say that it never happens in this neighborhood? Well, it happened in Colts Neck and Ocean Township. The mansions are gone from their family, and the businesses are gone. The trust is gone. The money is gone. And the man who took it is in a cell where he will remain until he dies. But here's the question that can't nobody resolve, right? That lingers in the back of my mind when I have been watching this and listening to the different commentary on this. It's not a question, basically, right, on whether or not Paul did it. Because at the end of the day, we all respect the jurors' verdicts. And those verdicts, right, come from physical evidence. It was a unanimous vote. The problem is, and what makes you ponder is how he even got to this place. How you wonder how someone who came from such a close knit family where they shared holidays and the birth of children, marriages, the success of the family business, and the name. You wonder how he get up in the morning and do this to his family. And not only do this to his family, but do it to 2 innocent children. And one of them 8 years old who fought back. A lot of people are thinking that this was about money. It was about a lifestyle, right, with Paul and his girlfriend and all the things he was buying. A lot of people think that it was just a fear of losing everything. And that wiping out his whole family was a solution. But it wasn't. Because at the end of the day, he lost everything anyway. He has less now than he would have had he simply told his brother what the was going on. He was already advised by the accountant, get your shit together, young. Just tell us where the money is. What happened? The youngest brother, he lost everything because he lost both of his brothers. One by death and the other one by murder. He lost a sister-in-law and a niece and a nephew. And then they had the audacity to drag his name in the trial and say, why y'all ain't point y'all fingers at Corey? In my closing, Sophia may have been 8 years old, but honey, she was fighting like a grown woman. She made sure that she left her evidence somewhere, and she left them right on her uncle's pants. And ultimately, it was that proof from a little 8-year-old girl that sent his ass to prison. She would be 14 now. And it's unfortunate that she did not get there. Y'all, if I have any updates on this story, I will be sharing them with you. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe if you like what you've heard today. And until next time, y'all be safe out there in the streets and in the water. Bye, y'all.